few minutes, few seconds anyway, for people to come in. I can see the numbers are still going up quickly, so we do need to wait for the virtual auditorium to fill up. And we'll still wait just a little bit longer. And I guess we can probably get started. We've already got 71 people. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wilmette Institute's first web talk for September of 2020. Today, we will be hearing from JoAnn Borovicka, a recent author who's done some very interesting publishing on different topics, and her subject today is things white people can do to promote racial justice. If any of your friends or you have problems continuing with this program, note that we're also broadcasting live over our YouTube channel and also over our Facebook page. So you might want to mention that to anyone if we max out. I should say a few words very quickly about the Wilmette Institute. It's now 25 years old, actually 25 and a half. We ran a summer program for several years, 10 years, and then gradually developed online courses, which we have now, of course, completely switched over to with difficulties of travel. So far, 612 courses that we have run online with almost 16,000 people who've registered for those courses from 127 countries. So we're really quite widely established around the world. We're very excited to see people from so many countries taking our courses. These students have used their courses in countless different ways, presentations to all kinds of different audiences, radio broadcasts, public speaking, speaking in front of churches, and then, of course, Baha'i study circles, classes of various sorts, fireside speaking at feasts. And now we've broadened out beyond these courses to also cover, provide web talks. And we're working on increasing our web publishing as well. Hopefully we'll be able to start symposia fairly soon. And we're also now pursuing accreditation. So keep that in mind. We hope to be able to offer courses for college credit in a few years. Work, of course, which needs financial assistance if you're interested in helping us out in any way. To mention a few courses coming up right now, Sustainable Development and Human Prosperity starts this coming Thursday. And then on Saturday, we have actually two youth courses. Saturday we have a Transformative Leadership for Youth course starting. Also another youth course that starts on September 12th as well. There's a Transformative Leadership Cultivating Transformative Leadership course for adults that starts also on September 10th. And then next week we have a Consulting in Marriage and Family Life and Leaves of the Twin Divine Trees courses starting. Leaves of the Twin Divine Trees, of course, refers to the women in the household of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. This is a very interesting course to learn about them. Moving on now to introduce our speaker today, JoAnn Borovicka, who is from Greenville, South Carolina. She is a researcher, writer, educator, and artist. And the artist side is the thing I have not actually witnessed, though I have certainly seen her as a researcher, writer, and educator many times. She's written two very interesting books, one on biblical topics, Light of the Kingdom, Biblical Topics in the Baha'i Writings. And now, of course, with Richard Abercrombie, she has sort of helped to co-write a biography of him called Crossing the Line, a memoir of race, religion, and change. She's also been a faculty member for the Wilmette Institute's Department of Religion, and she has done two web talks for us in the past, one on the 10 plagues of Exodus and the other one about parallels in the ministries of Tahareh and the Apostle Paul. Currently, as I mentioned, living in Greenville, South Carolina with the coronavirus epidemic raging, she is homeschooling her two grandchildren, Rose and Pearl, I believe 9 hours a day. And that we were just hearing about the challenge to do that just before we got started. So now we will turn this all over to JoAnn. Welcome, JoAnn, to the Wilmette Institute, to a web talk. And we are delighted to hear your presentation today. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay. And Rob, thank you for everything that you do for the Wilmette Institute. And let me see if I can get that up there. We
Yeah, you're go. We can see it.
good? Am I good? It seems that okay, yeah. My clicker wasn't working, but I think we're in gear now. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to this presentation about things that white people can do to promote racial justice. And you'll notice my website address. It's very straightforward, JoAnn, and you can connect my Gmail through there, and I'd love to hear from you. Okay, so the program overview. I'm going to talk briefly about the book project that put me here. Like, why am I talking about what white people can do? And 3 eye-openers in that book project that I will share what I've learned. And then things that white people can do to promote racial justice. As an outline, we're going to look at to learn how to think and speak about racial prejudice and why that's important. And to be aware of problems that come from ignorance of how racism manifests. And then inviting feedback on racist implications of our behavior. And then to how to prepare a graceful response to the feedback that you will get if you ask for feedback. And then to make action the standard by which we call ourselves to account. And I'm talking about white people. I suppose that is true for everyone, but this presentation is particularly for white people and from a white person who learned a tremendous amount by co-writing a book with a Black man. And we'll also look, excuse me, at abundant resources that we have for ideas about exactly what to do in whatever circumstances you're in. And then we'll have questions and discussion. So yeah, the project that got me here was co-writing Crossing the Line, a memoir of race, religion, and change with Richard Abercrombie. And it was a 2-year project. And of course, we're still working together now that the book is in print. The Abercrombie family was central to the growth of the Baha'i faith in upstate South Carolina in the 60s and 70s and ever since. And really, the family has served the faith all over the world. As a teenager, Richard was his family's very unlikely spiritual teacher, because he was seen as the trying to find himself in the darkness. And yet what he found was the Baha'i faith, and it transformed himself and also his family. It's a very exciting story. It includes, the themes are Black youth coming of age in a racialized society, a family search for religious truth, and stories of radical spiritual and social transformation in the 1960s. Richard has a very warm way of conveying his story, and it's also very intimate. It is an inside view of a young Black man's experience. I want to speak about our collaboration. Richard asked me to help him get his memoirs into print. Okay, so my job was to interview him extensively and to compose the manuscript. But I not only interviewed Rick, he'd say I interrogated him, but you get what you ask for. I also interviewed his family and his friends, those who lived through the 60s with him and also had transformative experiences with the Baha'i faith. And I also interviewed African Americans in the greater community, those who were another religion or no religion, just to get a sense of their experience, particularly in the 60s, and their experiences as young people growing up in a racist society. So the bounty here is that I spent 2 years talking with African Americans about the problem of racial prejudice and their personal experience. So I expected to learn about Rick's life. I didn't expect to learn about myself. And this is really what's brought me here, because I want to share. So I was asking about Rick's childhood, trying to get down, in his words, what it was like for him to grow up in a segregated society. And I asked him, when you were a child, how did your mother explain the rules of racism to you? What did she tell you to keep you safe? And this is the Abercrombie family, by the way, and it's a teenage Rick is the second from the right, next to Sherry, who's in the striped shirt. Well, Rick said that what his mother told him and all her children is what her mother told her, and that is, you've got to feed white people with a long-handled spoon. Be kind to them and give them what they need, but don't get too close. I'm going to read that again. You've got to feed white people with a long-handled spoon. Be kind to them and give them what they need, but don't get too close. So what's my reaction? I do not consider myself to be a racist person, but I felt that this rule was too familiar to me. I could feel it down in my bones. I really felt like Miss Lily, Rick's mother, was describing the dance that we're all doing. And something about her voice and knowing Rick, this really struck me. And I was baffled why I should be so familiar with this phenomenon, because as I said, I don't consider myself a racist person. And I've got a lot of reasons about that. And I have several reasons written out here, and I have them in dark print because ultimately none of this matters. But just to give you an idea of where I come from, my family has a diverse heritage and even more diversity in our extended family. My parents taught me to respect everyone. My father modeled inclusion and taking action for racial justice. So, you know, the white man in the family growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s, he went to a Black dentist. When he was in college in the 1940s, he had African-American fraternity brothers that he kept in touch with. Growing up, the books in our house included significant works on racial prejudice, say from James Baldwin and James Wright, Notes from a Native Son, and many others. And they were not only there, they were read and we talked about them. As a college student, I worked as an enrichment program for inner city children in Cincinnati. My graduate work focused on the pedagogy of liberation. And Paulo Freire, Miles Horton. As a young mother, I mentored a middle school African-American step dance group. We performed all over the place. My daughter was the only white child in that group. As a teacher, I initiated a study about teacher administrator racism and its impact on Black student achievement. I support local initiatives to empower Black people. I've got Black friends. My husband has Black friends. My children have Black friends. I'm a Baha'i. I believe in the oneness of humanity. And hey, I spent 2 years writing a book with a Black man who asked me to help him because he trusted me. So why am I feeling like this long-handled spoon rule is so familiar? Okay, and so here's a visualization of this. I think a default setting for most white people is that the problem of racial prejudice is something that exists outside of me, particularly what you might call white progressives who do believe in racial equity. So with this visual, imagining the white person is the character that's sort of on top and above racism. The tiger is a serious problem. It's harmful. And you do things to tackle it and you touch it sort of, but you're not a part of the problem. Okay. So we'll come back to that question and we'll find answers in the Baha'i writings. The second eye-opening episode was a story of Grace von der Heit. She's on the far left in the dark suit. So in the 1960s, Rick described Grace, who was a member of the Greenville Baha'i community, as an elderly, aristocratic businesswoman from the Northeast. She moved to Greenville, South Carolina, to help build the Baha'i community. And she was also a courageous public proponent of racial equity. And to give you an example, because she was a socialite, okay, she was aristocratic, the papers followed her movement, the social columns. And she would make it very obvious that she was going to a conference on race unity, or a Baha'i conference, or a conference on race amity in Cincinnati and various places. So this was in the newspaper. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, that was dangerous for someone to do. But Grace was a very courageous person, and so that's how Rick describes her. Now, sometime after Rick joined the Baha'i faith, many of his friends and acquaintances, who were all African-American teenagers, became attracted to the teachings of Baha'u'llah, and many of them joined the Baha'i community, and even more became a part of the activities of the Baha'i community. And you'll have to read the book to get all the exciting stories. So the small Greenville Baha'i community, which had been mostly elderly and white, doubled in size and diversity. So the African-American youth that were new to the Greenville Baha'i community felt that Grace von der Heit was prejudiced. And they talked about this among themselves, and they confronted her. Grace's response was, "Yes, I am prejudiced, and I'm trying to do something about it." Now, Rick describes this episode with the warmest love for Grace. And he said that after this, the youth never had any problem with her. And it was evident that she was trying to do something about it. But this stuck with me. I had questions. How could Grace demonstrate racial prejudice when she worked sacrificially in the Baha'i community? I mean, she had come all the way to South Carolina to encourage the Baha'i faith, and she worked for race equity. How could she show any signs of racial prejudice? And more so, why was Rick so fond of her if she did? I mean, from the Baha'i writings, we have very clear mandate that prejudices of all kinds are egregious problems. So from Baha'u'llah, "O humankind, associate in friendship, love one another, abandon prejudices of race, dispel forever this gloomy darkness of human ignorance." You can't get any stronger language than that about the egregious problem of racial prejudice. So, how could Grace continue to show racial prejudice? We will get back to that question too. The third eye-opening episode. In 1969, the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States invited certain Baha'i youth, all African Americans, to consult on their engagement in civil rights work. Why did they do this? They were in Chicago with the National Assembly for a weekend, at least. They did this because, you know, the 60s were a tumultuous time. 68, 69, you had riots burning in Washington, Baltimore, so many places, Detroit. Youth spearheaded many civil rights activities. Certain youth wanted to be at the vanguard of the movement, and the National Spiritual Assembly, as a loving shepherd, was concerned for those youth and that they would move forward in their social action within the parameters of Baha'i rules for social discourse. Okay, so it was a very loving meeting between the National Assembly and a group of more than a dozen youth. At the conference, the concerns of the youth included, quote, how could the community move forward when many white Baha'is were blind to the reality of racial oppression, as well as blind to their own prejudicial attitudes and actions? Now, of course, this resonates with Grace Vanderheit being seen as prejudice. Of all the things the youth could talk about, this was heavy on their hearts. Now, in hearing this with Rick, this stayed with me as well. And I remember hearing this same concern, the blindness of many white Baha'is to their own racist attitudes and actions in various venues over the past many years, including at national conventions, at trainings, at conferences. And those voices got louder in my heart. It seemed that in working on this project with Rick, I heard these voices much louder. And why I didn't hear them very loud before, I think the Baha'i writings answer that question too. Okay, so here's the question. Why are so many, I'll call them white progressives, and we could say, why are so many white Baha'is blind to their own racist attitudes and actions? I wrote down white progressives because this isn't specific to Baha'is, but it is specific to white people. Okay, so here we go. Here is the importance of learning how to think and speak about racial prejudice in the manner with which the writings do. Shoghi Effendi, Abdu'l Baha, Baha'u'llah, the House of Justice, the National Spiritual Assembly. So we're going to be looking at Shoghi Effendi and how he speaks of racial prejudice and how it is a mandate really to change the paradigm, to change the way that we are groomed to see racial prejudice. Shoghi Effendi states in Advent of Divine Justice, as to racial prejudice, the corrosion of which has bitten into the fiber and attacked the whole structure of American society, it should be regarded as constituting the most vital and challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community at the present stage of its evolution. There is so much in here. We could spend the next day looking at every phrase. So what have we learned here? Racial prejudice is not something that someone is or someone isn't. Racial prejudice is a corrosion that goes through the entire fabric of American society. Nobody escapes. And I appreciate the way that Shoghi Effendi points out that this is the most challenging issue confronting the Baha'i community. learn how to speak and think about racial prejudice. Okay, think about the corrosion. These are, metaphor here. Corroded water pipes. Everybody gets sick. If you have corroded ductwork, everybody in the house gets sick. Shoghi Effendi clearly states that the whole structure of American society is corroded by racial prejudice. If you have the whole structure of a house corroded, it'll bring problems and sickness and injury. This is a way for us to think of what racial prejudice is, not something that we can, that we're separated from, because all of us are a part of this society. This also from Shoghi Effendi, and it was quoted in the recent letter from the House of Justice. The American Baha'i community cannot hope to either escape the trials with which this nation is confronted, nor claim to be wholly immune from the evils that stain its character. Thank you. The House of Justice wants us now in 220 to know that this is the case. Okay, they're calling this statement from Shoghi Effendi to our attention. No one can be wholly immune from the effects of being raised in a racist society built on the foundation of white superiority, as we will see. Okay, so a common dichotomy, and a very popular one, is that one is either racist, guilty of racial prejudice, and therefore chooses to do and say racist things, or one is not racist, one is innocent of racial prejudice, and one chooses not to do or say racist things. But this is not consistent with the description of racial prejudice that we get from the Baha'i writings. Instead, Shoghi Effendi talks about the entire system is corroded and no one is immune to the effects. So this calls for a change of how we look at ourselves and our place in the society and our relations with others. So this is from some secular literature. Quote, structural racism is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it has been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. Okay, now, when Shoghi Effendi wrote Advent of Divine Justice, we have, I'll be referring to what amounts to a paragraph, which of course can be lengthy, of commentary on racial prejudice. Seems that today in the social sciences, those that are studying the phenomenon of racial prejudice and the culture of white superiority, they're all elaborations and confirmations of what Shoghi Effendi says very briefly and eloquently. You see it all through the social sciences today. Structural racism is a thing, just as Shoghi Effendi described. Okay, so I think this glacier image is helpful to understand what we're working with here. There are intentional acts of racial prejudice, violence, violations of the law, hate crimes, and they are most visible. But they don't exist in a vacuum. Underneath them, what upholds them is this system of structural racism that Shoghi Effendi describes. And this from the Oxford Research Encyclopedia. Structural racism are those invisible structures that produce and reproduce white supremacy and privilege. More from secular literature. Whiteness is a category of identity that is most useful when its very existence is denied. The mechanics of white supremacy A hidden system of social domination burrowed deep within the culture and subconsciousness. It is the worn grooves of comforting routines and unthinking expectations, patterns of a social order that have been in place for so long that it looks like the natural order of things. So there's this invisible quality to complicity with racism that we are groomed to deny. And look, here back to Shoghi Effendi in Advent of Divine Justice. He states, let the whites make a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of this problem, to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority. Notice in this particular commentary by Shoghi Effendi, the first thing he says that white people should do, their first responsibility is to abandon something, not to go rescue someone. Their first responsibility is to personally abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority. Maybe the only time it's a conscious sense of superiority is when you're the person in a march for white superiority. This is, as he says, it's a corrosion that goes all through society, and people are not immune. Okay. So again, back to our glacier. At the top, we have intentional acts of prejudice, they're terrible, killing, murder, intentional acts of prejudice that are very visible, structural racism at the bottom. And the importance, I'm proposing that the foundation of the whole glacier is the sense of white superiority and the culture of white superiority that, that we live in. Shoghi Effendi doesn't tell us to go into the world and to jail people who have committed intentional acts of prejudice, although they should be jailed, and God willing, they are. What he says the first thing, so it must be foundational, is to abandon the sense of white superiority. Okay. And this is going to take a supreme effort. Okay, so I'm going to reread some, and then we'll go on to what he says about a patronizing attitude. Let the white make a supreme effort. This will take a supreme effort in their resolve to contribute their share to the solution of this problem, to abandon once and for all their usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of superiority. Okay, to what end? To correct their tendency toward revealing a patronizing attitude toward the members of the other race. Isn't this fascinating? Shoghi Effendi could have talked about lynching. Shoghi Effendi talks about a patronizing attitude. It must be foundational to the structural, to the overt racism that we see. So what is a patronizing attitude? And again, we need to put this in our vocabulary, learn how to think and speak about racial prejudice in the manner of Shoghi Effendi. A patronizing attitude is apparently kind or helpful, but betraying a feeling of superiority. Condescending is often used as a synonym. And the behaviors involve interrupting people of color, talking over them, speaking or deciding for, the white savior complex, I'm going to fix this, assumption of white correctness, to treat haughtily or coolly is to be patronizing, To belittle the suffering of is to be patronizing. Speaking down to. In that, we have now two top things for white people to do. One, abandon the sense of superiority and to stop with the patronizing attitude. Top two things on the list. We need to become very familiar. We need to study what that is so we recognize it. Okay, from the House of Justice. Says, your nation's history reveals that any significant progress toward racial equality has invariably been met by countervailing processes, overt or covert, here we have hidden again, that serve to undermine the advances achieved and to reconstitute the forces of oppression by other means. That's in the July message from the House of Justice. So overt means that it is visible and recognizable. Covert means it might not be visible and not everyone recognizes it. There is a theme of invisibility, subconsciousness, and inherent qualities about the culture of white superiority. I find this chart helpful. Now, the House of Justice does refer to overt and covert forces. So I hope that I am not inappropriate. I'm going to take a leap to overt racism and covert racism. And you do find charts like this in secular studies. I've kind of created my own here. So I'm suggesting that there are levels of racism visibility. Well, actually, this is what the House of Justice says. So overt racism would be very visible to white people. Covert racism would include what is typically called institutional or systemic or structural racism. It is somewhat visible if you know what you're looking for, but it is often denied, and people will try to explain it away. And then at the bottom, I'm putting very covert, the least visible to white people, usually denied. And microaggressions is a term that I hear referring to these kinds of behaviors. So we would have everything that would be come from a patronizing attitude. We also have belief in meritocracy. Meritocracy is the doctrine that if you would just work hard, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. There are no forces working against you. And that is clearly false. Tone policing, being uncomfortable with Black culture expression in whatever fashion, of volume or tone, ignoring people of color, fear and avoidance of people of color. These are all microaggressions, typically not seen by white people who are not aware of it, often not seen by white people who are aware of microaggressions. And underneath it all, remember Shoghi Effendi's very first thing is this usually inherent and at times subconscious sense of white superiority. Remember that that is the very first thing he tells white people to do. Abandon that. Okay, so the institutional, systemic or structural racism, that looks like racial profiling, school to prison pipeline, discriminatory lending, housing, hiring, pay, inequity in education, inequity in healthcare, inequity in government representation, biased norms, and social systems. The House of Justice calls them. And then the overt racism, murder, marches for white supremacy, hate crimes, things that are against the law, typically, or should be. So, and they are very visible to white people, and that's what gets the most attention. So here's what happens. A white progressive, a person who believes in that we should all get along, the oneness of humanity, it is easy to think that because I am not committing any overt racist acts, therefore I'm not involved in this problem. We've already heard from Shoghi Effendi that nobody is immune. So you see that there's different levels with which we are vulnerable, and that we manifest racism. Okay, so what? A white person, and here I'm thinking of Grace Vanderheit. It was like, oh, I see. A white person can identify as anti-racist, believe in the oneness of humanity, and work for racial justice, and manifest racist attitudes and actions, or in some way be complicit with racism, and to manifest those things that come with being socialized in this society. Okay, so now, I'm thinking of Grace Vanderheit. I'm also thinking of JoAnn Borovicka, because I'm white and I was socialized in this society. And so then I have work to do, right? I have to examine this. It is innately inherent, usually inherent, and at times subconscious. So what a challenge. Here, the very thing we're supposed to do is something we're usually not aware of, and that comes so natural that it's described as an innate characteristic. Usually innate is a pretty strong statement. Okay, so also from Shoghi Effendi, the American Baha'i community cannot claim to be wholly immune from the evils that stain its nation's character. So yes, even Baha'is, and our African-American Baha'i brothers and sisters have been telling us this for years. Now I'm hearing it. I think before, when I heard it, I thought, well, they're not talking about me. They're not talking about the white Baha'is in my community. That's a situation that doesn't involve me. I'm not the problem. It's good to remember, it's sad to remember that in this country, being white comes with privileges and with socialization that you really can't get away from. So you're participating in this system, whether you like it or not. So we need to find the words and to think in ways that will help to dismantle it. So instead of, I'm not racist, like, the girl on the pillar trying to lasso a tiger, I'm separate from this problem. I've come to understand it differently. So I understand that I am part of a corrosive system of structural racism, that I've been socialized into a sense of white superiority that is foundational to the problem of racism, and that I've been groomed to be blind to it. That's part of the package. So I have a lot to learn. I need help. So problems that arise from ignorance of how racism manifests. If, as a white progressive, I'm ignorant of the ways that racism manifests, and if I think that racism is only the intentional violent acts of wretchedly mean, immoral people, then I could believe I am free of racial prejudice. Then I won't recognize my own covert or very covert racist attitudes or actions, and I'll miss the opportunity to change and contribute to the solution. Because what we need is change. We need breaking of the pattern. Yeah. Here's the paradox of white progressives. Because I, a white progressive, believe racism is wrong, and a dichotomy of either you're racist or you're not, okay, so this is in the ignorance mode, fear of being seen as racist will make me even more resistant to seeing my complicity with it. I will deny any implication that I am racially prejudiced, and I'll defend my moral correctness. So you see this in a lot of the literature today that is finally examining the culture of white superiority. It's the problem of white progressives, who some scholars believe cause the most daily damage to people of color. Okay. So, what do we do? Know that the default setting that white people usually are trained into, is that too strong? Usually, is fear, denial, defensiveness, and blame when they are called out for something that someone thinks has racist implications. Okay. What comes to mind here is the concern of the youth who met with the National Spiritual Assembly in 1969. They are concerned. How can we move forward when the white Baha'is are blind to racism in the community, the problem, and blind to their own racist attitudes and actions? Yeah, so what we have now is research that shows that happens, and this is a real thing. If you believe that racism is wrong, you'll be more resistant to seeing your own covert racist actions. Okay, so belief in the oneness of humanity is good, and belief is not enough. So the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States, this is from Forging a Path to Racial Justice. Now, we're looking at this because a common response to someone being called out or having a racist action or words brought to their attention is that, no, I believe in the oneness of humanity. Belief is not enough. Quote, to create a just society begins with recognition of the fundamental truth that humanity is one. Okay. But it's not enough simply to believe this in our hearts. It creates the moral imperative to act and to view all aspects of our personal, social, and institutional lives through the lens of justice. We are being told to take ourselves to account through the lens of justice, to learn what the culture of white superiority is, and to take action to interrupt it. Okay, so here, let's give an example. And I've seen this happen, so I feel strongly about this. Here we have a diverse study circle group, starts out the course by making a list of factors that they want in place for a spiritual environment. Okay, so this is a familiar exercise that's often done at the beginning of a study circle or a workshop or many things in the secular world and in the Baha'i world. Okay, so of the many things that are written down, they include to listen to each other, to show respect, and to help each other. Okay, here's what happens. One of the white women in the group says some things with racial implications of which she's unaware. That could be one or two or any of these. I don't see race. I was raised to be colorblind. Wow, you, a Black participant, are so well spoken. What she, a Black participant, means is, and then go on to say what you think she means. I may be white, but I've never been privileged. I lived in Japan, so I know what it's like to be a minority. We are one human family. It's as simple as that. The real problem behind racism is the economy. Okay. Any one of these things could have been said, or two or three. So during the break, one of the participants gently and discreetly points out to the white woman, who is her friend, the racial implications of her statements. And I remember this from James Baldwin. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. Right? So in love, she brings it to her attention in a way that she thinks is respectful. Well, typically what happens? A common response to this kind of feedback is, no, you didn't listen. That's not what I meant. But I'm not racist. And then a litany of reasons why not. But you don't understand. Oh, I feel like I've been disrespected. And now the person who brought this to her attention is accused of violating one of the rules of the course. Avoidance of that person then, and often tears. And I can tell you from 2 years of talking with African Americans about the problem of racial prejudice and their experience from childhood through adulthood, people of color have been exhausted by white denial and defensiveness. Okay, so we did have these factors: listen, show respect, help each other. But the unwritten rule that overruled everything and caused the problem was, you've got to feed white people with a long-handled spoon. Be kind to them and give them what they need, but don't get too close. It's the comfort rule. The white people have to be comfortable. And you can talk about racial prejudice, but you got to keep the white people comfortable. So the person who shared the racial implications of the white woman's statement, she was listening. She did show respect by her assumption that the white woman would want to know the racial implications of her statement, and she was helping her. But it's not perceived that way, and often then people then go to support the woman who's crying, and it's a mess. So what I'd like to suggest is that at the beginning of study circles or trainings or whatever, when we determine the rules for the group, that included in that is how and when people want feedback on their on what may be seen as racist impacts of their statements or behaviors. Maybe talk about that up front and have the group decide whether this is, individuals. Do you want that feedback? How do you want it? Do you want it in the group when it happens? Do you want it privately? And to talk about how this is a matter of listening, of showing respect, of helping each other, being obedient to the guardian, helping each other to do the number one thing we're asked to do: abandon the sense of white superiority and to stop with the patronizing attitude. Okay, so outcome of ignorance of how racism manifests. What could have been a rich moment of learning, sharing, growing, and building of trust becomes a source of disunity in that study circle, and people suffer. So to name the problem, as Shoghi Effendi does at the beginning, and to accept that that is so, and then to agree to help each other at the start would be a great bounty. Okay, so give the story a different ending. Break the pattern of white blindness and denial. Okay, as an individual, as you come to any group, you can say, and diverse group or all white group, because there will be white people who are more aware and sensitive to the impact of racist behaviors than you are. Okay, so everybody is a resource to you. And don't lean on your African American brothers and sisters, because they've been telling us this for hundreds of years and we haven't listened. So, I mean, don't expect more unless it's a really good friend. Okay. So what can you say? What do I say? I say, I realize that because I'm white, there are racial dynamics that I don't see. I would appreciate being alerted to the racist implications of anything that I might say or do. I can say I have and I do, and it works. There is, I get information, I learn things. There's also an appreciation from the people that I'm bringing this issue out in the open and just stating the fact. Okay, we call this the post-truth era in the news. So we need truth. And this is the truth. I realize that because I'm white, there are racial dynamics that I don't see. Okay, now, state your awareness and invite feedback. That's what we're talking about here. So instead of ruminating on all the reasons why I can't be prejudiced, which if it is likely to happen whether you want it or not, okay, you can say something else like, I'm learning what it means to be white in this society. I'd appreciate feedback on anything I may say or do that you feel has racist impact. I'm learning what it means to be white. You don't have to be embarrassed about saying that to your African-American friends or associates. They will be thrilled because they know what it means to be white. They know what it means for you to be white. And it's been really frustrating for the Black community that white people don't know what it means to be white. Okay. Practice a graceful response. Because once you ask for feedback, eventually you will get it. Okay. And you're going to really plan and practice a response, a graceful response. The default setting has typically been denial, blame, and defensiveness. We want to break the cycle, interrupt the system. And you can actually plan that from the beginning. I'll get to that in a moment. So here we have back to Grace van der Heid, who is now one of my heroes. And I can't even begin to tell you how much Richard Abercrombie loves her memory. Grace's stellar response when she was accused of racial prejudice. She said, yes, I am prejudiced, and I'm trying to do something about it. It's a very interesting episode. I hope you read it in the book. She's a little more fiery than this, I must say, but that's exactly what she said. Yes, I am prejudiced, and I'm trying to do something about it. Rick's response, the response of the youth, love and admiration. Why? Grace recognizes that she has prejudicial attitudes and actions. Now, this is no secret to your Black associates. Okay, your racist, your prejudicial attitudes and actions are not invisible to them. Okay, she confirms the reality of that prejudice to those who call it out. Okay, so, gaslighting, crazy making, that's not really true. You could see that happen, but no, that didn't happen. Yeah, so the youth appreciated the fact that they were confirming her reality. Now they have something to talk about. Okay, she declares that she is trying to root out that prejudice, and they saw that she tried. She continues associating with those who named her prejudice. She didn't try to avoid the youth in any way after that. She accepts the feedback like a gift, and she demonstrates change. This is a graceful response. Sorry about the pun, but I think it's worth remembering. So, practice a graceful response. And here you can tell, it would be helpful to tell people what it is, how it is you're going to respond if they give you feedback. And then you better be true to your word. So, something to do. I realize that I have been raised in a racist society based on white domination, and I have been groomed to not see it. I'd appreciate feedback on anything I may say or do that you feel has racist impact. I promise that I will listen to you and respond with, thank you. No explanations, no denials, no blames, just that. Listen and learn. Now, it's time to get out of the comfort zone of being white, and this is one way to do it. Okay, so again, back to these stellar youth. How can the community move forward when many white Baha'is are blind to the reality of racial oppression, as well as blind to their own prejudicial attitudes and actions? You know, take a screenshot of this and put it on your wall. Read it in the book. This is our challenge. If you see a problem, you can work to solve it. If you can't see it, or if you refuse to see it, then it controls you. And others who do see it can't help you. So here, these wonderful youth, they wanted to move forward, and yet there is this barrier, the white blindness. Okay, so call yourself to account in action. I'm suggesting you imagine yourself in a movable position on a continuum of racism, or say a continuum of working toward race equity, whatever you want to call it. On one side, you have complicity with the culture of white superiority, perpetuating racism. In the other direction, you have interrupting the culture of white superiority and promoting race equity. So in whatever context you find yourself, ask, what am I doing to actively challenge racism, to actively promote race equity? What am I doing in this situation? So it could be talking with your husband. It could be visiting with your family. It could be at a devotional. The Washington Race Unity Initiative that the National Assembly has shared the report of it on the Race Unity Action resource site. And one of the important questions that came out of that initiative and actions was that the institutions would ask, how does this decision impact race? Or what are the racial implications of this decision to race, gender, etc.? We can do this personally, wherever you find yourself, in the grocery store. What am I doing to actively challenge racism, to actively promote race equity? What are the implications of my actions in this situation, at feast, at various places? Okay, so we are reminded by the House of Justice in the recent letter, progress toward racial justice requires a path of sacrifice and high endeavor, a profound alteration of thought and action, a tremendous effort to play your part, however humble. So having a book club, inviting some friends to join a book club that deals with racist issues and to discuss it, that's a fairly easy thing to do, and it's high interest right now. It is humble and it is important. So whatever it is, we have to put things into action. And on the my little continuum here, I would propose that inaction at this time is complicity with the culture of white superiority and perpetuates racism. So what am I doing to actively challenge racism, to actively promote racial equity? I can't tell you what to do. You've got to figure out your continuum, because everybody's in a different place, has different resources, different situations. So figure out your continuum. Where are you and what do you need to do to move forward in promoting racial justice? Why are you comfortable? What do you have to do to become uncomfortable? Because until white people make the changes that will make them uncomfortable, things aren't going to move forward. The rule of keeping white people comfortable, be kind to them and give them what they need, but don't get too close, has to be destroyed. Okay, so we have an abundance of resources to help us. The The House of Justice, again in the July message, reminds us that the concepts and approaches for social transformation developed in the current series of plans that can be utilized to promote race unity in the context of community building, social action, and involvement in the discourses of society have been set out in our messages for the last many years. It is important that we pay attention first to the actions that we are asked to do by as Baha'is by the supreme body. So it's no mystery what those actions are. They're the core activities. It's engagement in social discourse. Yeah, all in the context of community building, and this done in light of the sacred text. So there are no new actions. We need to do the actions differently, but we need to move forward with the same activities, the framework of the plan. Okay. Amazing resources. And recently, like for this season, the message to the Baha'is of the United States came in July from the House of Justice. Then we have Social Action, a compilation prepared by the Research Department of the Universal House of Justice. When you read these documents, read them with others, read them with friends in the greater community. That is, to sit in your armchair and read something is an action. Reading is an action. And to read it with someone else takes it into the discourse and community building field. And we need that. And read it with a diverse group. You're going to learn stuff. Go back to the 2017 letters, just 3 years ago, from the National Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. Has very specific guidance for this time. And I mentioned Addressing Race, Class, and Culture, Reflections on Baha'i Institutional Efforts in Washington, D.C. That is on the Race Unity resource site under Ideas for Action, Community Building. And let's see, the Baha'i Bookstore. Go to BahaiBookstore.com, go to the search field and type in race. And there will be an abundance of books. And that is a profoundly important resource for us. I mentioned the Race Unity Action Site provided by our National Spiritual Assembly. It's a site to inspire action on the most vital and challenging issue. And so it has stories of what other people are doing. You can get ideas for what your next step is. You have to figure out where you are, where you need to go next in order to break this systemic problem. And also you can share on that site. So, that is a great motivation too, to be able to share, and your ideas may help others, your ideas and experience. Some wonderful books out, Seeing Heaven in the Face of Black Men by Todd Ewing. Read it. Urban Planning in the African American Community by June Manning Thomas. People who are wondering about exactly how structural racism works and what the government role has been in that, in its intentional perpetuation. These are informative books. No Jim Crow Church by Louis Venters, story of the origins of the South Carolina Baha'i community, but it is also in the context of the political and social situation in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So you learn a lot about structural racism from those books. And frankly, Google what white people can do for racial justice, and you'll come up with a million hits. It's just a few. 103 things white people can do for racial justice. Dear white people, here are 10 actions you can take. If you are in a study circle, if you've hosting a devotional, if you're thinking, what else can I do? Look in these secular resources. Now, remember, the Universal House of Justice reminds us it is not possible for you to effect the transformation envisioned by Baha'u'llah merely by adopting the perspectives, practices, concepts, criticisms, and language of contemporary society. So when you look to contemporary society for resources, just be conscious and aware of how they compare with the Baha'i program. Okay, so review. We're at the end of the presentation. Things for white people to do, whatever their chosen line of action. First of all, learn how to think and speak about the reality of racial prejudice as described in the Baha'i writings. Learn what structural racism is, use the word, and talk about it. Be aware of problems that come from ignorance of how racism manifests. Okay, know that it can be very covert, completely unintentional, and you still want to be made aware of it. Invite feedback on the racist implications of our behavior. And then you better prepare a graceful response to feedback and practice it before you get feedback. And then make action the standard by which we call ourselves to account. And know that there are abundant resources to help us. And that concludes this presentation. Oh, and here, yeah, actually, here's one more thing.
Okay.
Got out of place. Here we have other secular works. White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. The Color of Law, which is really a study of the how the government segregated America. And so you want to talk about race by Ijeoma Oluo. And these are some of my favorite books. Again, maybe not everything in them is consistent with the high standards of coming together in unity. I think that actually right now, what would be really great would be a study of the secular literature on white culture and compare it to Shoghi Effendi's commentaries. And that's it. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you so much, JoAnn. This is really fantastic. A presentation. The white audience members have all been, most of them anyway, have been making comments about how very much they've enjoyed it and appreciated it, and they've said it's fantastic and such. So I think you've been able to succeed in reaching the audience you wanted to reach today. Of course, a lot of people who we wish could have been reached didn't even tune in, and that always is a problem with any of these kinds of programs.
Right.
We've got quite a few comments and quite a few question and answers, so I'll go to the questions and answers now. Several people are asking whether they can get a copy of the presentation, the PowerPoints, for example. And are you going to share them to us so we can put them up on the website?
Yeah, I've already shared the PDF with Nikki.
Great.
And you're going to post the presentation, right?
The video will go up on our YouTube channel, and there'll be a link on there's a web page already for this talk on our website, and cool. that will no longer have the link to how to register. We'll replace that with a link to how to click through and watch the presentation.
All right. But if anybody has trouble accessing that, they are free to contact me. And my website address is on the screen.
Right now it's there, yes. JoAnnBorovicka.com, or presumably your email address is the same as the website.
Yeah, well, my email is accessible through the website, but my email address is JoAnnBorovicka@gmail.com.
Yeah, so, simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Well, Allison asked, what can white people do to not be defensive and angry when confronted with Black anger towards whites in the secular or even religious communities? So it's a slightly different context than the one you spoke about, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what I did, I really honed in on a passage in Advent of Divine Justice from Shoghi Effendi and just looked at some few key things. I didn't even finish the paragraph. Towards the next part, he says, is to master, for white people, to master their impatience of any lack of responsiveness on the part of a people who have received for so long a period such grievous and slow healing wounds. Okay, so I would say empathy, and as a white person, I cannot imagine what it is like to be a people who have been oppressed and subjugated for generations. So read Joy DeGruy's post-traumatic slave syndrome. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the damage that's done it's real rage. It results in real, natural, authentic rage, and there has to be empathy for that. Yeah. So James Wright, Native Son, he talks about in his, that's an older book, but it presents the criminal behavior of a young African American, but it also is very demonstrative of what got him there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what gets people to that rage is the helplessness. You know what? I really can't speak for Black people, so I'm not even going to try going there. But I think that it is important for white people to realize that the foundation of this whole problem, as I believe is stated by Shoghi Effendi, is the culture of white superiority that has dominated power and benefited from injustice and oppression for so long. So it may be uncomfortable to hear that rage. And I think the important thing is that we do hear that rage.
Yeah, one of the African-American members of our audience made a comment about how incredibly tiring or exhausting, I don't have it in front of me now, it is to have whites just simply not getting it year after year. And it's, you know, our society, our whole country, all the values of our country are, equality, advancement of yourself, pursuit of happiness. All of these statements in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence have set up expectations for all of us.
Right.
How we can live in this society, what we can achieve in this society. And the fact that our society denies that possibility to large numbers of its own people, its own citizens, is beyond frustrating. Right. And it's understandable the pain that will result.
Yes.
At least as a white person, I can go that far in understanding.
Yes.
I'm not sure if I can go all the way that I would like to, obviously.
Right. Something that was helpful to me, there's a book, the title is Caste, as in the caste system, C-A-S-T-E, caste, the origin of our disconnects. And the author's name evades me. But what it is, it's a study of how, a theory of how the racism in America is a caste system. And it was helpful for me to think of it that way, that it's a caste system where this neutral attribute, which is color, has now come to be a standard of deserving or not deserving, of desirable or not desirable. And I remember being outraged as a youth when I learned of the caste system in India. Mm-hmm. And I think that looking at the similarities and that dynamic is helpful to look to have some empathy for the seriousness of this.
Mm-hmm. Another question we have here in the Q&A, I have to get to the chat as well. Of course, the chat already has 34 comments in it. What are some examples of promoting racial equity and combating racism within the white community versus the greater community? suggestions for whites and blacks working together to change things. Is it all up to whites? What can white people do to help blacks rather than taking over in a mixed race work group, which could be seen as perpetuating racism?
Well, now there's a lot of stuff in there, Rob. That was, whoa, wait a minute. You know, Shoghi Effendi, in that same passage, he does make it clear. Let neither think the solution of so vast a problem is a matter that exclusively concerns the other. Yeah, so after he describes the responsibilities of whites, he then describes the responsibility of blacks. And you know, as soon as I start thinking about what the responsibility of the Black Baha'is are, I get derailed. It's like the ego wants to jump on that train. The ego wants to think about what their responsibility is. I know that we both have responsibilities. And right now, my responsibility is to be focused on what white people should do. And I'm not sure that I caught all those questions. Do you want to look at that again and pick out just one that we could respond to?
This particular one, it was a one paragraph question, you might say. What are some examples of promoting racial equity and combating racism within the white community versus the greater community, meaning whites and blacks together, I suppose? Suggestions for whites and blacks working together to change things? Is it all?
Okay, hold it there. Okay. One thing we've found helpful in, that I found helpful here, and other people have as well, is to read books on racial prejudice, and to read the White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Race, or So You Want to Talk About Race, to read those books with white people. When we started the first book club, we invited everybody. Only white people showed up. And one of the reasons for that, some African-American friends shared later, was that they are so tired of white people not getting it that they just couldn't sit and try to read this book with white people and hear their avoidance, denial. It's like, no, y'all go do. You just do it. Just do it. And so we did, and it turned out to be very helpful. And so white people can help white people to recognize their characteristics that come from this sense of white superiority that's usually innate and at times subconscious. You can work together with white people.
The book Cast was the author Isabel Wilkerson.
There you go. Thank you, Rob.
Heather identified that. She's
Perfect.
also the author of The Warmth of Other Suns, which is a very important and fascinating account of the movement of African-American populations from the southern United States to the northern United States.
Okay, yeah.
Then we have there are more questions here, if I can get at them here. Yeah. This is a rather long one, and I think I know what the person is asking. This person is saying, sometimes there are things she says that might sound racist. She says, perhaps naming my behavior, for example, interrupting, as racist is misconstrued, particularly if it's really a habit I have in all my interactions, regardless of the racial makeup, and a possibly acceptable behavior in a milieu where interrupting is cultural, familial, and acceptable norm. If I respond with a suggestion that this is a non-racist habit that I'm working on, I am then labeled as racially defensive and shut down from correcting a misconstrual. Mm-hmm. Interesting.
I feel your pain. I'm an impetuous speaker. And if I talk over someone, it's typically I'm paraphrasing what they say, or it's like, yes, or yeah. And what I personally have come to find is that regardless of my intention, I'm still interrupting somebody. So I really have to work to break that. And so it may be something that I do to everyone. So to me, it doesn't have racist implications. But when you do that to a person of color, because it has been done so many times with racist impact, from a person with an attitude of that you're not important or you don't matter, that when you do it, it's another microaggression.
Yep.
So it's one of the challenges. Shoghi Effendi states that this is a long and thorny road, and that it is fraught with pitfalls.
Yep.
Yeah. So unless you feel like you are on a long and thorny road and you've just fallen into a pit, maybe you're not doing the work. So, I mean, hooray to notice that thing and its effect. To me, what that is, it's like, it's being alive. It's being aware of racist implications. It's being aware that something I just did was taken as racist. It wasn't my intention, but now I have a choice of how I'm going to control that in the future.
Yeah, I think you're right. Apologizing for interrupting the person is definitely the best thing to do, and saying that it could very well have been a racist thing, but was not my intention. Yeah. We hear lots of stories about cultures where people speak slowly and they're given a lot of time and there's silence between speakers. And that's not the way we're used to speaking. And of course, there are other cultures where interrupting is more common. Mm-hmm. And everybody wanting to become agitated and speak actively is more common. And this is always an issue, I suppose you could say.
Yeah.
How can we work together without this becoming a white-black issue? This approach can perpetuate defensiveness and separateness. How can I use my experience as a Jew, for example, to find commonalities between our shared experience, instead of looking at this as a binary, whites are always wrong kind of blame because I'm white? I'm also interfaith, olive-skinned, a Jew, a Christian, a friend of a Baha'i, etc. Do I have to live in a white sinner's mind and body just because others see my whiteness? That's the pain.
Yeah. It is, first of all, I want to say that I have no authority whatsoever to answer anybody's question. The reason, the thing that brought me here, it was a 2-year project of constantly being, but I'm not any authority on anything. But what I heard in that was, and I feel it as well, the anguish of realizing, and so I'm probably projecting, but the anguish of realizing that what I thought was all things good, that being the white community, is suddenly not. It's just not. I mean, the fact is that I am the progeny of a white culture that has systematically oppressed people of color for its own profit. And that is not something that I like, but I can't deny the historical truth of it. And so I don't feel like I'm personally a bad person. I have to recognize my place in this structure that was already in place before I got here. And I don't know. So I also think you brought up a very good question, the questioner. How can you bring your diverse experience and heritage to, how can you use that to bring people together? I think that that's an important question and worth exploring. And I can't tell you how to do that, but I think that you could.
This reminds me a bit of some archival research I did once when the Baha'is in Providence, Rhode Island, all of whom were white, wrote an auxiliary board member who was African American saying, how do we teach the faith to Black people. And her response was, the same way you teach it to everyone, you love them. And trying to establish true connections, true friendship, true bonds of affection between people is always the most important thing to do, whether they're interested in becoming Baha'is or not.
Yeah.
And if, the person feels that they're being stereotyped by other people, trying to establish that warm connection is one way of chipping away at it, at least.
Yes. Yeah. And that's also the biggest challenge. What else do we have in here? Okay. So for people of color, through a corresponding effort on their part, show by every means in their power the warmth of their response, their readiness to forget their past, and their ability to wipe out every trace of suspicion that may still linger of so vast a problem. Okay. All right. Still linger in their hearts and minds. Yeah. Every trace of suspicion that may still linger in their hearts and minds. Who's got the harder job?
Yeah.
To be white and to abandon this sense of security and he says sense of superiority and power and comfort, to abandon that, or to forgive centuries of violence and oppression.
Yeah. And in one's own daily experience.
And one's own continued daily experience. That's right.
That's the really difficult part, that just reminds everyone of the past as well.
That's right.
The past doesn't go away when it's the present as well.
Yeah.
Let's see.
I've got a question that somebody had sent in earlier.
Okay.
Actually, before the talk. Says, it seems to be a challenge for white people to move from comfy armchair of educating ourselves into the more challenging field of action. Can you suggest ways for white people to embrace action? Well, there's the question, isn't it? That's the question. And if it was easy for all of us to embrace action, I think that then every Baha'i household in the nation would be hosting a devotional gathering and having children's classes, and there would be a junior youth on every, it's like we're prompted for action continually. So for me personally, it's the initiative to learn more, and I thought I knew it all. It's like, I'm not stupid. I studied the pedagogy of the oppressed. I didn't, but the motivation to learn more was that I felt it in my heart. Mm-hmm. I love Rick. He's telling me a story. He's sharing, the important, intimate moments. And I'm talking with these African Americans who are trusting me and being generous with their hearts. So to me, the motivation to do more and to take more action came from the heart.
Yeah. I thank the blessings that I have received from so many African American Baha'is who have been so kind to me and patient with me.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And this is something that makes any kind of a journey possible, really, mm-hmm. when you have that reinforcement and that love and that support.
That's right.
And there are plenty of African American Baha'is who want to help that way too. Mm-hmm. There's some people obviously who've been hurt, and it's harder for them, but people who have been hurt sometimes also realize they have to help too. And it varies from person to person how they react, it seems to me. But
yeah,
I count my blessings with the first time I went to a picnic at Greenacre, sponsored by the Hartford Baha'i Community, and discovered to my surprise I was the only white person there. And they made me feel very warm. I was a young man from a white town who did not have any Black friends at all. And they made me feel so welcome and loving afterwards. I said, thank you. I did say thank you so much to them because it touched me.
Yeah.
Really touched me.
Yeah. Yes.
Anyway.
I have to say that with interviewing Black people for 2 years, and they loved Rick, so they were very, generous with me and trusting. I had no idea the degree to which there is a Black forgiveness of their white friends and associates that happens a lot, moment to moment, that white people are not aware of. And it's because of the white blindness and all that, which Shoghi Effendi talks about, and that I reviewed. I remember one thing, I was talking to a woman, it was a phone interview. I've never met her in person, an African-American woman, and she is a college professor. And I asked her about the difficulty of trusting white people in the Baha'i community. And she said it's a constant challenge. And she said that they lived in the community for many years, that she had worked with this white woman, been in her home many times, considered her a friend. They served the faith together. It was a long and trusting relationship. But when the Black woman had a baby, she had her first baby, and the white woman came to visit her, it took all the strength in the Black woman's body to let the white woman hold that baby.
Interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So it runs deep.
Yeah. Can showing too much caring and empathizing with the hurt of African Americans be understood as a patronizing attitude?
Isn't that an interesting question? That's an interesting question. And I don't know, I guess too much empathy. I don't know. I think the world, I don't think the world has ever had too much empathy. And I'm not an expert on the nature of patronizing attitudes, but I think that's worth some research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if, quote, that was not your intention, is said, the impact of what you said is still there. Sandy notes. Gwen says, I'm glad you mentioned reading secular books and working with secular and non-Baha'i people and organizations. Yeah. I think the guidance is very clear on this, but my experience is that Baha'is avoid working outside the faith. They seem to think that the core activities alone are going to solve the problem. I saw this effort to reach out to non-Baha'is as lacking even in the Washington, D.C. paper. Can you speak more to this and maybe even recommend some organizations we can work with? Okay.
That's actually that was one of my lines of action that I wanted to pursue. I wanted to, I just, started that a couple of years ago. I wanted to learn more about like-minded people in my community who were working to empower African Americans. And so trying to think of what might be sort of a universal resource. Certainly there's Black Lives Matter chapters in every place, and you can contact them, you can go to their programs, you can listen.
There are the older organizations too, the NAACP, the
right, all those, reach out to all those.
I've been involved in those in my experience.
Yeah, the United Way has, I believe in most of its locations, the United Way has a section which they call the Faith-Based Roundtable. And what that is, it's an invitation for leaders of religion, typically ministers, but for us Baha'i, members of the spiritual assembly, for religious leaders, diverse religious leaders, to come together about once every 3 months, once a quarter, to learn about what's happening in the community in terms of helping people, what resources are made available, housing, mental health. They have different things. And as a Baha'i, I was welcome to come into that group. In fact, they were thrilled because the goal is to have as diverse a group as possible. Yay! So, Baha'i is so exotic that it was,
We're diverse.
Yeah.
We're diversity.
Oh, yeah, we bring the diversity. Yeah. So you might look into your United Way chapter locally and see if they have a faith-based roundtable. And I'm sure that they would welcome Baha'i participants. Things have slowed down a little with the pandemic, but they may well have online things too. And then I discovered local programs, a initiative called Beyond Differences. That is basically, it's a junior youth program. They do they do much of the same thing, but it is non-denominational. It's not sponsored by the Baha'is. It is completely non-denominational, but they do character building and mentoring of young people by older youth. And so I've am working with them in what they're doing. You just need to, if you look under United Way, they often have a list of various charitable or service organizations. And so that might be a good way to find out what's happening in your locality. Yeah. It's a bounty to do that.
We've been now going an hour and 40 minutes, and we probably can't go much longer. We have huge numbers of questions and huge numbers of chat. Obviously, we can't get to all of those. People are also raising their hands, and I frankly don't know how to answer hand raising anyway. So people are better off putting their questions into the chat box or the Q&A. But there are 2 more questions that I see here that I think are quite interesting. Where's the first one? Gwen's here. I like. Are you still there? I hope everyone
yes, she is.
Still...
She's good.
Okay. My computer just did something strange. Gwen says, I'm glad you mentioned, wait a minute, I read that one. Yeah, I read that one. Sorry, let me move down to the next one here. Here's, Gwen's other comment. As a Black person, I think it's harder to forgive. Also, didn't Shoghi Effendi say in Advent of Divine Justice that justice is more important than forgiveness? Do you have any comments about that, Gwen? Justice more important than forgiveness.
Well, it is the universal house of justice. It's not the universal house of love.
Yeah.
It's not the universal house of forgiveness. It's not the universal house of sharing. It's the universal house of justice.
Yeah.
And I think forgiveness is the massive task. That doesn't Abdu'l-Baha. Now, if I can't quote, I'm in a dangerous place. But Abdu'l-Baha discusses Christ's crucifixion and that the purpose of it was to teach forgiveness. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Allison, I think this was the other one I wanted to show. Wait a minute, let me get my window in a more convenient place here so I can read better. Bill says, my greatest challenge in dealing with white Baha'is who express racist attitudes is their expression of Baha'i principles. For instance, using unity to deny the effects of systemic racism and their own personal prejudices. Efforts to tactfully bring to these friends' attention the effects and nature of their words and actions has led to personal attacks against me and others who are trying to be thoughtful about the cancer that infects our society.
See, there you go. That's the default reaction.
Yep.
It's like people, we're wired to do that. We're wired to do it. But there was a quote in the, I used a quote in the presentation of, and now I can't bring it up, but that belief is not enough. Belief is not enough. It's not enough to say that you believe XYZ.
Yeah.
Like, that's good. That's a good thing. That's that's important at the start, but it's not enough. And so good luck with that. Now again, see, Shoghi Effendi says that this is a long and thorny road fraught with pitfalls, but good for you for attempting to bring it to their attention and for enduring the backlash.
Yeah.
That's an action. That is something to do. That's an action. And we can be sure that whatever we do, nobody's going to pat us on the back and say, oh, good job. Don't expect that.
Yeah.
But that maybe that might happen sometime, but to say something and to do something and say something to interrupt the system is imperative now. And maybe doing it one way didn't get the reaction you'd prefer, maybe another way, or maybe just not worry about it.
Well, those are actually, we did hit the bottom of the Q&A near as I can tell, and we have quite a few people have been saying thank you. One person says, I'm Black, I'm a Baha'i, thank you so much. Truth, I must leave early, but thank you anyway. And quite a few people have been very, very grateful for this presentation, JoAnn.
Well, I apologize for speaking to the topic of racial prejudice as a white woman who has a lot to learn. But because I did learn something, I felt motivated to share. And I hope other people do too.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. We're very grateful for this presentation today, for the great questions, for the marvelous answers that you've been able to provide as well. And we look forward to having you back again in another year or two, perhaps after you write another book. I'm sure you have something else in mind, or perhaps something from your art, which probably relates to social change as well in one way or another.
Yeah.
So thank you again, JoAnn, for this marvelous presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your questions today and for participating. And we will see you again on one of these web talks in the future. Have a good day. Bye-bye.